Hello and welcome to the fourth in the IEA's Zeroing In Free Market Approaches to the 2050 Target series. Over the last 3 decades, governments have repeatedly set targets to achieving net zero. To some, these lack urgency. To others, they're unachievable in the time frame. Will 2050 be another target that passes us by? What are the free market solutions to climate change and pollution? Would a carbon tax disproportionately hurt the poorest in society? These are just some of the issues we aim to address in our Zeroing In series. First, we interviewed Kingsmill Bond from Carbon Tracker, who displayed optimism that the market has already provided us with the foundations we need to achieve net zero carbon emissions by the 2050 target as set out in legislation. Our second guest, Richard Toll, Professor of Economics at Sussex University, was more sceptical, but he was supportive of a carbon tax as a possible policy solution that he argued could nudge industry to meet that target. Our third guest, Dr. Jamie White, a classical liberal academic and author of Crimes Against Logic, says net zero will be very difficult to achieve and require incredible political will. He challenges the notion of anthropogenic global warming and argued that that could warrant a Pigouvian tax on the emission of greenhouse gases. I'm delighted today that we're joined by Professor Philip Booth. He's Senior Academic Fellow at the Institute of Economic Affairs and Professor of Finance, Public Policy and Ethics at St Mary's University, Twickenham. Hello, Philip.
Hello there.
Now, Philip, to the extent that we need to decarbonise, what market mechanisms are there already there to achieve it? And indeed, actually, do you think it is achievable, that net zero target by 2050?
Well, of course, the net zero target is definitely achievable. It's a question of what do you want to trade off net zero against? So we've seen that locking down the economy in the last few weeks in order to try to reduce coronavirus deaths is achievable. The decisions which politicians are having to make is locking down the economy worth the damage it causes when compared with the potential benefits? And of course, the politicians may change that view on that over time and therefore release the lockdown. So you can achieve almost anything you want. The question for economists, though, is always the trade-offs. Lionel Robbins once said that economics is the science of not being able to have your cake and eat it. Well, you can't have zero carbon and some of the other things we might want as well. And some of those other things, of course, might also lead to better health, better education, better well-being, and indeed even better resilience against climate-related weather events and so on, which may increase in prevalence if we don't actually achieve net zero.
Do you think government intervention is strictly necessary? Do you think that's the only way that you could achieve the target?
Well, I don't think we can achieve the target without having any government intervention at all, because reducing carbon emissions to such an extent is not something people will naturally do without encouragement from government in one form or another. The reason for that, of course, is that they don't bear all the costs themselves of emitting carbon. Those costs are spread very widely across the world. But if we, a good start, I think, for an economist is to look at all the possible policy tools and start by using those that will create the least costs and then move on to the higher cost policy tools until you've decided that it's no longer worth the cost of actually pursuing the policy. And there's an incredible range of things that governments could do to reduce carbon emissions, which would actually be beneficial, because there are lots of ways that governments, through their policies, actually encourage carbon emissions. So worldwide, governments at the moment spend well over $4 trillion on fossil fuel subsidies. Our own UK government spends about £13 billion on fossil fuel subsidies. And it does that through not charging the full rate of VAT on domestic fuel consumption. So right across the world, governments are effectively subsidizing the production of carbon intensive and the consumption of carbon intensive fuels. A second big thing that governments around the world could do would be to introduce road pricing, so that car owners actually paid a greater proportion of their taxes when they use their cars, and when they use their cars, especially on congested roads, because congestion tends to lead to greater carbon emissions. Our governments sort of played around the edges of that with the London congestion charge, but very few governments have really decided to adopt proper systems of road pricing. So there are lots of win-win policies which could be introduced in this area. And then, of course, the next best thing the government could do would be to introduce some kind of carbon tax. That will be the cheapest way to get the largest reductions in carbon emissions.
How can we adopt rational policies or set optimal targets when it's so difficult to quantify the costs and benefits, particularly if we look at decades ahead with various unknown unknowns, and when human influence on the climate is overlaid on natural change? How do policymakers determine what should be the optimal global temperature, and who ultimately should make that decision?
It's argued that the global atmosphere, in a sense, is a public good. That is, that we're all able to pump carbon dioxide into it without really, and potentially then damaging the climate without bearing the costs ourselves. And we're all able to draw the benefits from the atmosphere without it being able to exclude anybody else from those benefits. And public good problems are really quite difficult to solve. We know that. And global public good problems are especially difficult to solve. So politicians really, and it has to lie with politicians, do have to make some kind of judgment. And that judgment might be that interventions will actually, in the long run, just cause more problems than they solve, because there's no way of developing a coherent set of interventions which won't eventually be captured by some interest groups. That's a perfectly respectable position. A different position is to say, well, we need to make some rational attempt to put some cost on carbon emissions and ensure that people are paying the costs of their own activity, paying for the costs of their carbon emissions in terms of the impact that will have on their climate, and that whatever we do in this domain, which is rational and uses the best science, will be better than ignoring the problem altogether. So there are two approaches, both of which I think are reasonably consistent with a general free market approach to economics.
You have argued in the past with our previous guest, actually, Dr. Jamie White, on whether or not a Pigouvian tax on the emission of greenhouse gases is necessary. You suggest you would support a carbon tax, but under very clear conditions. Could you just set out, Philip, what those conditions are?
Yeah, okay. So I would support a carbon tax if other interventions in the energy market designed to support or subsidize renewables and non-carbon intensive forms of energy were removed as well, because I'll come to this in a moment, but those kinds of interventions actually are quite damaging from an economic welfare point of view, and potentially also from a climate perspective as well. So that would be one condition. A second condition would be that accepting the fact that a carbon tax might well have the greatest costs to the least well-off, you'd have to find a way of reducing other taxes and directly relating, I think, for political reasons, the reduction in other taxes to the income from the carbon tax. So, and you should reduce those other taxes in a way which especially benefits the poor. So, for example, you might have a carbon tax and use that revenue directly to reduce the rate of VAT, or have a carbon tax and reduce that revenue directly to increase the personal income tax allowance, or something along those lines. Now, the problem with the policy of subsidising renewables, which is often suggested as an alternative to a tax, because subsidies always sound attractive to people, because people always see the benefits of subsidies without actually understanding that there are costs as well. So people don't like things being taxed, but they do like things being subsidised.
Yes.
But the problem with the subsidisation of renewables is that it leads us to increase energy consumption in general, and potentially, in fact, not reduce carbon-intensive energy consumption at all. So if wind power and other forms of electricity are made cheaper, I might respond to that just by heating my house more rather than by reducing carbon-intensive forms of energy use, which I could do, for example, by wearing extra clothes or insulating my house or only heating one room at a time or something of that nature. So a carbon tax should generate exactly the right type of behavioural responses. Subsidising renewables and other forms of other ways of trying to tackle the problem might generate some of the right behavioural responses, but is likely also to have an awful lot of waste connected to it.
So you wouldn't support things like there are some people who believe that the government should be subsidising public transport, for example, as a way in which we can reduce our carbon footprint, or subsidising lower carbon alternatives. You wouldn't support that?
I definitely wouldn't. No, we should understand what the problem is, and that is that carbon emissions impose a cost on others. And if we want a policy intervention to deal with that, we should ensure that consumers bear the cost of their carbon emissions. I mean, think what we do, what happens, for example, if we subsidise, let's say, subsidise railway. There are some countries, Luxembourg, for example, that's made mass transit entirely free. Well, there's no question that railways and other forms of mass transit, they do actually use an awful lot of carbon, both in the running of the trains, but also in their production. They're made of heavy-duty steel. So you're subsidising a form of carbon emissions. Now, they may not emit as much carbon as, say, travelling by car emits, but then that's a reason for taxing travelling by car, not a reason for subsidising the train. But there are also lots of other knock-on effects. So people might transfer from the car to the train if you subsidise the train, but they might also transfer from bicycles or from walking to the train, or they might adjust their habits in other ways, so live further from work because the train is now free. So subsidising things which use less carbon in the hope that you'll incentivise people to move from high carbon emitting activities to lower carbon emitting activities actually has the potential to undo all the good you might hope to do by encouraging people from moving to move from zero carbon emitting activities such as walking or taking a bike or living close to work to activities which do actually emit considerable amounts of carbon, such as taking the train. So there's lots of bad policy in this area.
And that's the risk, isn't it? That there are many unintended consequences with what you might assume are, very justifiable ways in which we can reduce our carbon footprint.
Yeah, absolutely. As Bastiat would put it, the seen and the unseen consequences. And what happens is that you get organised and articulate political lobbies that lobby for something because the first round consequences benefit them. So people lobby for subsidies for renewables and subsidies for public transport because they can easily see the benefits, but the costs are really very difficult to see.
Philip, I wonder if you might reflect for a moment on why you think it is that climate change is sometimes viewed as a failure of capitalism. Would you agree with Dr. White that the connection isn't obvious aside from high levels of output in successful capitalist economies? And by output, I mean carbon emissions. And why the affinity between why is there that affinity between environmentalism and socialism? And shouldn't environmentalists be at least neutral, I guess, regarding their favoured economic system?
Yeah. I mean, if you look at the environmental record of socialist governments,
yes.
I mean, it's absolutely appalling. And one of the reasons for that is that because in most, there are three reasons, I think. So most socialist countries tend to be very poor.
Yeah.
And when you have a choice between eating and preserving the forest or eating and clean air, you tend to choose eating in favour of rather than a better environment. As you become richer, in a sense, a good environment is an income elastic good, and we tend to be more concerned about the environment. That's one reason. A second reason is that socialist economies tend to be very inefficient, so they use more of all sorts of inputs in the production process. So it's true that capitalist economies produce more, but the amount of environmental resources which go into each unit of production tends to be much less. So that's the second reason. And the third reason is because, by their nature, socialist economies don't tend to have well-protected property rights. And if you don't have well-protected property rights, if ownership isn't clear, if judicial systems don't function properly, then people tend to exploit the environment, log the forest, and nobody ever takes them to court as a result. I think about 50% of all logging in Brazil is illegal logging, and it's just poorly functioning court systems and so on. Now, when it comes to carbon emissions, the issue is slightly different, because those usual ways of protecting the environment by ensuring that you have well-defined and well-protected property rights don't work, because it's a global problem. If I pump more carbon into the atmosphere, it affects people in Bangladesh at least as much, if not more, than it affects my own community. And so I suppose people see it as a problem that capitalism cannot easily solve. Now, the fact that it's a problem that capitalism cannot easily solve doesn't mean to say that it's a problem that's caused by capitalism, because it's certainly a problem that socialism cannot easily solve. If we all ran our economies in the way that Venezuela runs its economies, I can tell you there'll be no progress whatsoever in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But of course, it does take us outside our usual comfort zone as free marketeers, because it does have this global public good element to it, and therefore, you have to look at other mechanisms, and if you want to address the problem, to try to find those mechanisms which are most compatible with free markets in other respects.
That's a really interesting point. I mean, I think to a certain extent, Philip, we're seeing that at the moment in the United Kingdom. Your point on when the economy is in dire straits, people's priorities change. They no longer care so much about the environment.
Absolutely.
And that is reflected in polling at the moment. That it was put rather, I'm not sure it's a direct trade-off, of course, but it was put to everyone that was polled in this specific poll, whether or not they would prefer to prioritise the economy or the environment post-coronavirus. Guess what won? The economy.
That's the economy, absolutely.
And so that illustrates your point, I think.
Yes, it does. And I'm pretty sympathetic in general in relation to environmental concerns. Now, by nature, I'm conservative with a small c, in the sense of liking nature and wishing to conserve and nurture nature on a small scale and on a large scale. I'm also quite risk averse, so I don't like taking big risks with the climate.
You're not a NIMBY.
I'm not, but I'm not a NIMBY. No. But the other thing which the climate extremists, I think, should bear in mind, anti-capitalist climate extremists, is that if you look at the impact of globalization and the way in which people have got extreme poverty has reduced very significantly. Yes. The wealth that's been generated by freer markets, obviously not entirely free markets, but freer markets, has supported a much larger world population than would ever otherwise have been possible, and supported them in a state of health and well-being that was better than anything they've ever enjoyed before. So I really do think that those people who are concerned about the environment, even those people who have a pretty apocalyptic view about carbon emissions and the potential impact of carbon emissions, they should be looking at how we can use markets in order to overcome the problems we face, rather than actually move to the system that historically and everywhere where it exists in the world at the moment has only ever supported a subsistence living for a small number of people.
Yes. Philip, you've previously said, I think, and correct me if I've got this wrong, but you've previously said that the green rhetoric is often that we will all have these fluffy green jobs and a green standard of living without any hardship from reducing emissions, but that we cannot have that and that there will be trade-offs required. Do you think politicians are being honest about the trade-offs?
No, I don't think they are. So I think some green activists, to give them their credit, are. I think it's fair to say that Caroline Lucas would say that we have to make choices, and she may not put it the way I would put it, and indeed she believes an awful lot of things which I think are seriously wrong and detrimental in terms of protecting the environment. But her ethical approach will be totally different from mine as well. I don't want to suggest I support her, but I would compliment her and some other Greens on being honest in saying that and for that matter, Pope Francis, who talks about the environment a lot, for saying that there is a trade-off here. If we want a better environment, we have to give things up, and it's clear that we do have to give things up. It's the usual problem that economists always face, that jobs and working are actually a cost of producing something and not a benefit of producing something. So when we have green jobs, that's an indication of the costs of getting a better environment, because those people are not employed doing other things that they might otherwise be doing. So to talk about green jobs as being a benefit of environmental policy, which is more interventionist, is totally wrong. Green jobs are a cost of environmental policy, because if people weren't doing those things, they could be nurses or teachers, or producing cars, or working in supermarkets, or doing something else. Environmental policies, except the ones I suggested at the beginning about removing energy subsidies and so on, if we want an improved environment, we have to give up something else instead. It goes back to Lionel Robbins. Economics is about not being able to have your cake and eat it.
Well, speaking of having your cake and eating it, do you think that, and I wonder if I'll have this be your sort of ending conclusion, but do you think we're living through the prescription put forward by the likes of Extinction Rebellion right now? When going through the economy basically put on ice, with apparently global carbon dioxide emissions are likely to drop by 6% this year, according to the World Meteorological Organization. But I wonder, because we're experiencing many families during this current period will be experiencing quite severe economic hardship. I wonder, do you think that decarbonisation measures, including a carbon tax, would also end up disproportionately hurting the poorest? Is that something policymakers should really be quite cautious about?
It certainly is something they should be cautious about. And as I said earlier, when if a carbon tax is introduced, I think it should be introduced in such a way that there's a very clear link to other forms of tax reduction which benefit the poor. And to some extent, you can go a long way by win-win policies, stopping subsidising energy, introducing things like road pricing, stopping subsidising renewables, and so on. But then, if you have a carbon tax, and if you really do try to get a sharp reduction in carbon emissions, there will be costs from that. And that is really a debate which, not quite my type of economist, but economists do need to inform. What are the costs and benefits of interventionist action in trying to reduce carbon emissions? Always bearing in mind that when you introduce policies in practice, they won't actually turn out to be as efficient as the ones that economists wish to introduce in theory.
That's a very good way of ending that. Professor Philip Booth, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you. Thanks.
Now, don't forget that you can subscribe to this channel, and we are putting out more content than ever before during lockdown. So do join us as we put out and respond to the economic crisis that the United Kingdom is currently experiencing. Thank you very much.